came down the approach at 200 miles an hour, flat, nose level, no flare at all, because the landing gear ran down the center line of the fuselage like a bicycle, and lifting the nose would simply have dropped the tail onto the runway. Behind it, a ribbon chute streamed out to hold the airspeed steady because the engines took too long to spool up to rescue a bad approach. The men who flew the B-47 Stratojet called it the least forgiving airplane they ever touched. And if you have ever flown on a commercial airliner, you have flown its descendant, not its spiritual successor, its descendant. Look out of the window at the wings swept back from the fuselage, at the engines hanging in pods on pylons slung forward and below that wing, and you are looking at a layout worked out in Seattle in 1946 for a nuclear bomber. Almost everything since has been a variation on it. The numbers are strange in every direction. First flight, December 1947. 2,032 built. More than the B-52, more than any American jet bomber before or since. In service, it was faster at altitude than most of the fighters sent up to intercept it. And it was effectively finished as a bomber within 15 years, being cut up in the desert while the aircraft it had taught to fly were only just beginning. To understand why the shape mattered, you have to go back to what came before it, and to the fact that Boeing got it comprehensively wrong first. Between 1943 and 1945, the company worked through a sequence of jet bomber studies, the Model 424, then the 432, and they all followed the same logic. Take the aerodynamics of the B-29, a straight wing and a deep fuselage, and replace the piston engines with turbojets. On paper, it should have been transformative. In the wind tunnel, it disappointed for two reasons that compounded each other. Early turbojets drank fuel so heavily that low-altitude cruise was nearly pointless, forcing the aircraft high, where thrust falls away. And a thick, straight wing runs into compressibility, shock waves forming on the upper surface, drag climbing steeply, well below the speed the engines could theoretically deliver. The airframe was throwing the engine away, so Boeing found itself holding a contradiction. The propulsion belonged to the future and the aerodynamics belonged to the past, and no amount of refinement to the second was going to unlock the first. What the company needed was not a better straight wing. It needed a reason to stop drawing straight wings altogether. That reason arrived in May 1945 in a filing cabinet in northern Germany. That month, an Allied scientific mission moved into the Hermann Göring Aeronautical Research Institute at Völkenrodem, outside Braunschweig, a complex of wind tunnels the Allies had not known existed. Among the Americans was George Scherer, Boeing's chief of aerodynamics. What he found in the German files was Adolf Busemann's work on wing sweep, theory and tunnel results showing that angling a wing backwards delayed the onset of compressibility. Scherer wrote home immediately. The mechanism is simpler than it sounds. What matters to a wing near the speed of sound is the airflow crossing it perpendicular to the leading edge. Angle the wing backwards, and that oncoming air meets a section which is effectively longer, and therefore relatively thinner. The critical Mach number, the speed at which shock waves first appear, moves up. The same wing, tilted, buys you speed for nothing but geometry, except it was not for nothing. Sweep solved the aerodynamic problem and immediately created a structural one because it broke the airplane Boeing had already drawn. In every study up to that point, the engines lived inside the wing, buried in the root where the structure was deepest. Sweep the wing back, and there was suddenly nowhere for them to go. There were two reasons why not. An engine buried in the root forces that root to be thick, and a thick root is exactly what sweeping the wing was meant to avoid. You pay for the sweep and then discard the benefit at the most critical station on the aircraft. The second reason is blunter. It places a fire and a set of spinning turbine discs inside the primary load-bearing structure. The answer Boeing arrived at looks, at first sight, like a mistake. Take the engines out of the wing entirely. Hang them underneath it, in streamlined pods, on pylons that stand the engine forward of the leading edge and below the wing surface. Every instinct says this is worse. You have added wetted area, added interference drag, and put 6 large obstructions into clean airflow for no obvious return. The return is structural. A thin swept wing is flexible, and flexible wings flutter, bending and twisting, coupling together into an oscillation that can destroy the structure in seconds. Where mass sits along the wing changes that behavior completely. Hung on a pylon ahead of the wing's elastic axis, the engine acts as a mass balance, damping the coupling and pushing the flutter speed upward. The pod buy back the margin the sweep took away. That decision cascaded. A wing thin enough to justify sweeping has no volume left for a main undercarriage, and there are no wing-mounted nacelles to hide one in. So the gear went into the fuselage. Two main units on the centerline, one forward and one aft, with small outrigger wheels tucked into the inboard engine nacelles to stop the aircraft tipping over on the ground. A bomber on a bicycle, which produces the behavior we opened on. An aircraft with its gear on the centerline cannot rotate about a main axle because there isn't one. It has to be built at the incidence it will fly off at and then accelerate until the wing simply lifts it clear. The takeoff run became enormous. Boeing's answer was to bolt rocket bottles to the rear fuselage and light them, 18 of them on later aircraft. By 1951, Boeing had the fastest bomber in the world and a machine that would try, in three separate and unrelated ways, to kill the people flying it. Each of those three problems was a direct consequence of the swept wing. None of them showed up clearly in the wind tunnel. All of them showed up in squadron service. And the fix for every one of them is now fitted and as standard to the aircraft you fly on. The first is Dutch roll. On a swept wing, a side slip changes each wing's effective sweep unequally. So yaw generates roll, and roll generates further yaw. A coupled wallowing oscillation, nose swinging one way, wing dropping the other. On the B-47, it was lightly damped and easy to provoke, and a pilot correcting by hand usually ended up half a cycle behind, feeding energy into the motion rather than taking it out. The solution was not aerodynamic but automatic. A yaw damper, a small system that senses yaw rate and moves the rudder faster and more precisely than a human can, killing the oscillation before it builds. It was among the earliest pieces of automatic stability augmentation in a production aircraft. It is also fitted to every swept-wing airliner in the world. And if you have never once heard of it, that is rather the point. The second vice is stranger. An aileron changes the load on the wing, but on a thin, flexible, swept wing at speed, that load also twists the structure. Deflect an aileron down and the wing ahead of it twists nose down, shedding more lift than the aileron gains. Past a certain airspeed, the twist wins and the control simply reverses. Roll left and the aircraft rolls right. The third is the one the crews talked about. Bicycle gear meant no flare, and a wing built for high-altitude cruise put the aircraft on the backside of the drag curve on final, where slowing down increases drag and recovery depends entirely on engine response. Early turbojets had almost none, so the B-47 flew its approach with a ribbon chute streaming behind it, adding drag deliberately so the throttles could sit high and the engines stay spooled and ready. And here is what all of that adds up to. Every one of those fixes, the yaw damper, the spoilers, the potted engines on their pylons, the swept wing itself, was worked out on a bomber, at government expense, between 1947 and 1953. In 1954, Boeing rolled out a private venture prototype called the 737-80. It was not a new configuration. It was the B-47's configuration, scaled up, thickened where it needed to be, and fitted with seats. That aircraft became the 707, and the 707 became the shape of civil aviation. Trace the list forward, and it becomes almost comic. Swept wing, B-47. Engines in pods on underwing pylons, B-47. Spoilers for roll control at speed, B-47. Automatic yaw damper, B-47. Potted engines also let you certify, inspect, and replace a power plant without ever opening the wing, which is why nobody has seriously gone back to burying them. The bomber did not influence the airliner. The airliner is the bomber domesticated. There is a quieter piece of evidence, too. Alongside the 707, Boeing built the KC-135 tanker on the same basic architecture. The B-47 was gone from the bomber force by the middle of the 1960s. The KC-135 is still flying, re-engined, rewired, structurally renewed, but recognizably the same idea, more than 70 years after Scherer opened those German files. The configuration outlasted every mission it was designed for, which raises something uncomfortable. The aircraft that set the template for the next 70 years of aviation had one of the shortest and hardest service lives of any American bomber. It was not retired because something better arrived in the same role. It was retired because the role itself moved underneath it, and because the airframes were wearing out faster than anyone had planned for. Strategic Air Command had bought the B-47 as a high-altitude bomber. By the late 1950s, Soviet surface-to-air missiles had made high altitude the most dangerous place to be, so the fleet was pushed down low and taught a violent new delivery, a toss maneuver, pulling up sharply and throwing the weapon forward while turning away to escape. Turbulence at low level and repeated high-G pull-ups loaded that thin, flexible wing far outside the spectrum it had been designed against. The bill arrived in 1958. Cracks were found in the fittings where the wing attached to the fuselage, and the fleet was progressively grounded for inspection. The repair program, Project Milk Bottle, named for the shape of the replacement pins, reworked those joints across hundreds of airframes in a matter of months. It saved the fleet. It also confirmed that the aircraft had been asked to do something it was never built to do. After that, the end came quickly. The B-52 could reach targets the B-47 could only reach from forward bases in Britain, Spain, and Morocco, and those bases were becoming politically expensive. The last B-47 bombers left the operational force in 1910, less than 19 years after the first flight. The reconnaissance variants held on a little longer, and the RB-47 crews working the Soviet and Baltic peripheries had by some distance the hardest and least publicized job in the fleet. Which leaves one question. This story is almost always told badly. The popular version is a straight line. Allied engineers open a filing cabinet in 1945, and the modern airliner falls out. It is a good story. It is not quite true. So how much of the B-47, and therefore how much of the aircraft you fly on was actually German? Busemann had not hidden his work. He presented wing sweep at the Volta Congress in Rome in 1935 in public to an international audience that included American and British delegates, and it was largely ignored. Independently at NACA Langley, Robert T. Jones arrived at the same conclusion during 1944 and 1945. So the captured data did not supply the idea. What it supplied was tunnel results that ended the argument, accelerating a conclusion which was already forming in two places at once. And sweep on its own is not the B-47. The German work said angle the wing. It did not say hang the engines in pods on pylons ahead of the elastic axis to raise the flutter speed. It did not say put the undercarriage on the fuselage centerline or replace the ailerons with spoilers or fit an automatic yaw damper. Those were Boeing's answers to problems the sweep itself created, and those are precisely the parts that became the template. So the B-47 sits in an odd category. Judged as a weapon, it was a qualified failure, expensive, short-lived, dangerous to its own crews, obsolete very nearly on arrival. Judged as an argument about what a fast jet aircraft ought to look like, it is one of the most influential airplanes of the 20th century. It lost its mission and won the shape, and the shape is the one you board. If you enjoyed this story of flight, subscribe to Wings and Stories. New aviation history episodes several times a week.